Visit chamberpension.ky.
The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan, we're here for you. The Chamber Pension Plan is asking for all members to ensure their member details and contact information is correct and up to date. To review and update member details, simply visit chamberpension.ky. Log into your account and provide the necessary information for your personal profile and for your beneficiaries. For assistance in updating member details, call us at 745-7630 or email admin@pensions.ky. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you.
From Radio Cayman Studio, this is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community.
A very good morning and warm welcome once again to Money Sense. I'm Simon Cawdery and I'm delighted to be joined in the studio this morning by Mr. Rick Redding. Now, Rick is a new guest on our show, but hopefully one who will come back in the future if we drag you out of bed at such an early hour in the morning, Rick. Rick has a wealth of background in the financial services industry, having worked as a managing director for products and services at the Chicago Metals Exchange, if I have read your bio correctly.
Chicago Mercantile.
Mercantile, sorry, Mercantile, I always get that wrong. And you are the current CEO of the Index Industry Association, which is a not-for-profit organisation serving the global community of index providers. Now, Rick insists that I explain that he's going to say some things today which are his own personal views and not those of any of his employers. You're worried that you might say something so controversial at such an early hour in the morning that it could get us all into trouble. Is that the problem, Rick?
Anything could happen this early in the morning.
Well, indeed, yes. Or nothing, as the case of. Well, look, today's show is going to be a run around a variety of topics that are relevant and germane to where we are in the world today in terms of the financial industry. There are an awful lot of hot topic items, but perhaps no hotter and no more current topic than the US debt ceiling, which in many respects probably shouldn't even be a topic that we need to talk about, but it is. So give us more.
It is a bizarre situation that we find ourselves in every year. And I was in Washington last week, so I have a little bit of insight I think I can help share here. But just to set the stage, why do they even have the debt ceiling?
That was going to be one of my questions.
Prior to World War I, every piece of legislation had to be funded on its own in the United States. So with the advent of World War I, they created a law that said we just have to do this once a year. So this goes back a long way, and think about it, it's probably been, since 1960, it's been approved 78 times, I think. So they go through this charade because it's money that's already spent.
Because budgets have already been approved 3-4 years ago, and it was inevitable that those numbers were going to lead to the debt we are, because you spend X, you take in Y. If one is greater than the other, the debt's automatically going to increase. So no one could not have been aware that debt was going to be increasing. Yes,
and actually that's a great point, because a lot of times the political parties use this as negotiating for the upcoming budget that needs to be presented and passed. So a lot of what you see in the debt ceiling talks are really just pre-positioning to try to argue their positions ahead of the budget.
But where we are is because of budgets they'd already pre-agreed.
Agreed.
Year 2, 3, 4 years ago. So why doesn't this change? Why do we have this at all? You've given us the history of why it exists. Lots of things in history existed and then can get changed and no longer exist because they become superfluous to requirements or pointless or stupid.
This is so the political parties can beat each other up every year on spending. And like I say, it's mostly used for political theater more than anything else.
But it's such an unsatisfying answer, isn't it, to say it's purely so that politicians can argue at each other. It doesn't achieve anything. There's no spending, there's no budget created from this.
Like I say, most of it's just to pre-position for the budget negotiations that are coming up.
So, okay, so that's where we are. But what's going to happen this time round then?
So mostly this gets resolved without so much fanfare. This year, like I say, the politics are involved.
Because there's one party that controls the House of Representatives,
Correct.
which is where budgets get made.
Correct.
And then the other party just about controls the Senate and hanging on by a lifeline to the presidency.
So that's exactly right. And so in these years where you have divided government, that's when you tend to see more political theater than normal. It is fascinating to watch just how it unfolds, because in the beginning it's always, this is never going to get done. We're just so opposed to one another just because of the political divide in the United States. And in the last moments, it usually gets done.
We might go and stray onto a tangent here, but there are some commentators who are talking about invoking all sorts of unusual amendments. I think it's the 17th Amendment, which says that the validity of the US government's debt shall not be questioned. And then there are others who say, why not mint a $1 trillion gold coin? What's your take on all those sorts of things?
So those are actually too interesting, and those get trotted out every few years when there's a serious debt ceiling debate. The 14th Amendment, Section 4, is exactly what you said, and some people are saying it would be unconstitutional to default on the debt. Most lawyers don't think that's going to hold up, so they threaten it every now and then, but no one actually believes it will work. The $1 trillion platinum coin is actually an interesting idea that they would issue, from the Federal Reserve to the Federal Reserve. I don't think anyone wants to go there. I think I'm in the optimistic camp. This will get resolved in the last moments, because a couple things happened last week that were really important. And that is, last Tuesday there was a terrible meeting that nothing got done. But usually what comes out of those, and what has happened historically, is they get all the big players out of the rooms and they get technical experts and get a small number of people.
So get rid of the politicians.
And get the people that could actually balance a budget or prepare a budget. And those are the ones who tend to work everything out. And I'm in that camp. And the reason I'm optimistic is you've seen both the Speaker and the President say they think they can get it resolved by the end of the week. And with the President cutting his G7 trip short to have a press conference on Sunday, that tells me that they at least have a framework in place, because if not, it's going to be bad for him politically to come back and say, oh, we still don't have a deal. So I think they have a framework anyway that they're working on.
He could come back and hold a press conference and say, good luck, folks.
Yeah, he could. But what's the downside of that? So both parties lose if there's not a deal. The last time this happened was what, 2011? Mm-hmm. And, what happened? The equity markets fell 15 to 20%, depending on what index you look at. The irony is government bonds actually rallied.
Because they were seen as a safe haven, despite the fact no one was paying them.
Exactly. It was a flight to... So that's why I say this. I am in the camp that this will get resolved, because it's all a little bit silly.
Let's maybe speculate for a second or two. Let's pretend it doesn't get resolved. What does a default look like? It's a strange one, because they don't need to default on everything simultaneously. So what likely happens?
Well, in the dates are artificial as well. So they said the U.S. could run out of money on June the 1st. And truth probably is that it probably doesn't run out of money till the end of the summer. I mean, if you look, too, there was record tax revenues in April of this year. So they kind of made up the date to create the spectacle to finally get something done. If it doesn't happen, they prioritize spending, and they'll drag this out forever. Now, one of the outcomes we didn't talk about is they could agree to just kick the can down the road and say, we'll up the debt ceiling for 6 months and we'll be back in the same place again.
But that's just to try and put more pressure on coming up to a new presidential election cycle, I presume.
And it will get close to where the budget season is too. So I think they'll spend more time on the budget than they will on the debt ceiling. I think that's the end game here is negotiating on the budget.
And I suppose the logical thing, if one were to start with a blank piece of paper, would simply to say, let's have a budget negotiation, because the debt ceiling is irrelevant in that context. It is nothing more than one part of an equation. Everything else is the full set of equations.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is all about the budget.
It does seem, particularly mad. There have been scenarios where the US government has furloughed staff and promised to pay them 3 months later and stuff like that. So that's a path that could go, and then you start to see national parks being closed. You start to see certain services not happening. But that's problematic over the summer season when people are travelling and air traffic controllers might not be paid. All those sorts of complicated, bizarre sort of circumstances.
So the Treasury can prioritize what gets paid. I mean, they, typically when you ever run into one of these issues, they say, look, Social Security would be paid, the military would be, things like that. Yes, they may not pay the federal workers for some period of time. They may close the parks, as you say. It all gets worked out in the end of the day.
Okay, so we have an optimistic Rick on the debt ceiling. In which case, let me try and ruin your optimism by discussing the banking crisis. The ability of senior people in banks to really do particularly stupid things.
Yeah, this is a particularly interesting situation we find ourselves in the bank. And I'm not in the camp that it's a full-on crisis yet.
Okay.
Now, there's a couple more stages that could happen, and then I think you're in a banking crisis. But they can avoid it if they're smart. So what's happened in this case is, horribly managed banks, very bad regulators, not seeing the problems coming, or being, or stepping up and doing the right thing, making them do the right thing.
Potentially.
Who knows what the real story is on others? It'll all come out. That's the good part. And you have another piece here that is the central bank. I mean, it's raised rates aggressively to fight inflation, and so it's put a lot of pressure on banks. So at this point, this is a strange one because most time when you have bank failures, I mean, the immediate cause is always they have a difficulty funding themselves like this. But it's usually because their assets become impinged, meaning the value of them goes down.
People stop paying their mortgages or their car loan or things like that.
Exactly. Think about some of the biggest ones in recent history. It's all been about the mortgage, that people stop paying their mortgage.
Which you might have thought would have happened with mortgage rates having gone up so tremendously because of Federal Reserve tightening policy.
Exactly. And that's why I'm saying I'm not at the full crisis scenario yet, because this has all been about funding more than it is about quality of their loan portfolio. And typically when you see big banking crises, no matter where they are in the world, it's the quality of their assets that is really happening. Now, why I'm not in that camp yet is I think there's an intermediate step before you get to the assets being diminished in value in a big way, and that is a lot of times you have the next step could be a credit crunch or a lack of credit being issued into the marketplace. I think that how much impact we have there will determine whether we have a banking crisis or not.
In a sense, though, that's part of the function of Federal Reserve policy is to try and create a modest credit crunch because they don't want so much money flowing through the system because that itself is what's partly generating inflationary pressures. So the Federal Reserve is trying to engender a partial credit crunch against the backdrop of banks having not really managed themselves very well.
Couldn't agree more, and that's why what you say here is, and the one thing the Federal Reserve did do is they telegraphed these rate increases very, very. I mean, you had to miss the signs.
You had to work for a bank otherwise. Really.
And senior management.
Yes.
And so these banks that didn't hedge their assets and liabilities are just I don't know what to say about them. I mean, they were just asleep at the switch.
Yeah, and yet, yet in the US there are so many small banks as well, and that's partly perhaps one of the problems. The really big banks have sophisticated asset management liability teams and sophisticated modeling functions. The US has thousands and thousands of small banks, and it's quite difficult probably to have the sophistication you need in a very small organization, but you need the sophistication. Is that part of the problem, too many banks in the States?
So it's a great point that a lot of your listeners probably don't understand the U.S. banking system, which is different than most in the world.
Yeah.
And that most countries have a handful of banks, call them 5 banks that are huge and are the only game in town. In the U.S., there's 4 banks that are huge and they're systemically important. And then you have 4,000 plus banks out there that are regional or in community banks. And you have to, and the reason why this is interesting in the U.S. and why a lot of people overseas don't understand is you have national banks and you also have state chartered banks. That's why there's so many banks. So most banks are actually state chartered and are in local communities.
I presume is it easier to get a state charter than a federal charter? Then?
Yes.
Which
typically. Every state has different regulations, though. So some are quite difficult.
But if you're, and I speculate, entirely speculative here, but if you were an organisation looking to set up a bank with insufficient quality and controls, you would go down the state route most likely in a favourable state than you would the federal route.
Well, typically you do it in the state wherever you're located, wherever your deposit base is. But it's much cheaper to become a state bank than it is to be a national bank.
Got ya. Look, we need to take a quick break. Stay with us and rejoin our conversation on current financial affairs with Rick Redding.
The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. Become a member today. With 6 flexible life cycle funds, we help you plan for financial security in retirement. We keep our members informed with the plan's performance through quarterly fund fact sheets. We have an all-in expense ratio of 0.75%, over 16,000 members, and 337 million CI dollars in assets under management. If you would like to join or require further information, visit chamberpension.ky. And for information as it happens, follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Email admin@pensions.ky or call 745-7630. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. Become a member today.
This is
Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back to Money Sense and our conversation on global financial matters with Rick Redding. Rick, we teased our listeners just before the break with the quantum of banks in the US. We didn't quite explain why there are so many of these things.
So, as I say, you have these 4 or 5 big banks like you see in most of the rest of the world, but there's this whole system of regional and local community banks that tend to be the lenders to small and mid-sized businesses. You know, in some parts of the U.S., they're also the lenders to farmers. So they actually provide a very necessary function to a lot of those communities. Because those big kind of systemically banks are not really involved in that kind of local community activity.
But allow me to play devil's advocate ever so slightly here. This might have been a true statement pre-internet. Post-internet, it's quite possible for a farmer in Wyoming to go online and say, these are my credit metrics, I've got this amount of sales, and someone in New York to say, that looks fine, lend you the money. You don't necessarily need somebody in Wyoming in a building there to walk around and say, yep, he's a farmer or she's a farmer, or there are a way. In fact, some of the most sophisticated scoring systems now are based off sometimes social media postings as to the quality and the likelihood of someone repaying. So it seems to be almost built for a generation 2 ago.
It's true that the internet's made things much more transparent, and it's part of the reason why the deposits, fled so quickly in this crisis. But there's also a feeling that if the bank's in your community, they're more willing to loan you money than someone in New York. You're a part of the community, they're a part of the community, and that's why there's this system of still all these local banks.
Makes me want to say kumbaya.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're getting to the right place. I think one of the outcomes of the banking crisis we have now is there'll be fewer banks in the U.S. I mean, and you've seen this. I mean, if you'd be shocked to know how many banks there were in the 1980s, there were almost 15,000 banks in the United States. So, and what's happened too is, not only technology, but, it's a scale business to a certain extent too. So, and now because you have to have so much cybersecurity and you have to offer mobile banking and all the other things, a lot of these smaller banks just can't do it. Yeah. So what we have seen is a combination, a lot of merger of these smaller banks. And that's why there's a second tier of banks that are quite large by international standards called regional banks. Those are a lot of times roll-ups of a lot of banks in several states that all come together.
Getting that economy of scale.
Getting their economy of scale.
So one of the reasons, and you alluded to this, one of the reasons that we're potentially in a or could be in a banking crisis, or might find ourselves in a banking crisis, is because Federal Reserve's put up interest rates a lot in order to combat inflation, and we're sort of at an unsure place now as to, will interest rates stay where they are for a few months? Will they start coming down, or will they go up further? There's been a lot of talk from Federal Reserve governors in all directions in this matter. Where do you stand in terms of where inflation is right now and what that might mean for future direction of interest rates?
So that's the proverbial $64 million question.
Well, with inflation, that's not a lot of money. Okay.
Yeah, that'll all be inflated away. That's a difficult question to answer because, to your point earlier, if you're trying to manage the economy down by raising interest rates and taming inflation, the question is, how big a recession will it cause, or will it cause one at all? If it does cause the contraction that most people see, that means that there will be less upward pressure on rates. However, you could end up with a very strange situation where the economy goes into recession, whether it be small or large, or just contracts. Technically, recession is a technical definition. You have a slowdown in business activity. Let's just say that. And the central bank's trying to keep rates high to fight inflation, but the market says, no, there's a lot less strength in the economy than you see. Rates actually come down on their own. And then you have this gap between where the Federal Reserve wants rates and where the market's pricing rates. Something has to give in between there. And that becomes an interesting scenario.
It also seems quite interesting to me that we could, to your point, we could enter a recession or slow down in economic activity, but it become a bifurcated one. And we're sort of seeing that over the last few years in the growth experiences we've had, where the growth rate has come from the top 20, top 30% of the population. They've done very, very well over the last few years. But the bottom 30%, and particularly the bottom 5, bottom 10, but the bottom 30 or 40% haven't actually seen their incomes grow by any stretch of the imagination. So when you look around the consumer space, you see the luxury brands doing incredibly well because people are spending everything they can on those. But some of the old-fashioned retailers who were at the lower price points are going bust and continue to go. Bed Bath & Beyond, you have Target coming out with profit concerns, all those sorts of companies. So you could see that the Fed's actions actually just widen this wealth gap that exists in society today.
Yeah, the worst tax you can impose on any country or any group of people is inflation, because inflation hits everyone. But inflation is very regressive. Inflation hits the lower income people the hardest because they're trying to buy food. They're trying to buy gasoline to get in their car to go to work. That takes a bigger part of their paycheck every day. The top end of the scale it's inconvenient, but it doesn't really force them to say, well, do I, take my medicine today or do I go get something to eat? So inflation's really the problem when it comes to how well people are off, because it's not even on wages, but it's what I would call real wages, is how much are you getting paid? Everyone's pay is going up, but it's not going up faster than inflation. Yeah. So in real terms, it's harder and harder every day to make ends meet.
And more and more people in the States are relying on food stamps, are relying on government handouts, and living increasingly below the poverty line. It's a really worrying signal for what might happen to the US.
Well, it is. I mean, it's something that politicians need to think about, and I think that's what a lot of the budget debate will be about, is what's the level of social spending versus discretionary spending. From what I heard last week, it doesn't seem like a lot of those entitlement programs are really on the negotiating table for the budget. It seems like the kind of 11% of the budget that's discretionary is really where the fights are going to be. So if the military's not in, if Social Security's not in, if entitlements are not in, then you're really just fighting over the 11% of the discretionary budget. So we'll see where it ends up, but ultimately it's always a fight over, in some of the things that the Republicans put in this bill was, a work requirement in order to get some of these benefits. So I don't know that that'll go anywhere, but that's at the heart of it. That is what the budget's going to be about.
And talking about sort of bifurcation of wealthy versus the non-wealthy, and what that means for society. One of your former hometowns, Chicago, seems to be going through some trauma. What the devil's going on there?
Well, you're seeing this in a lot of the big cities in the United States. Chicago. I lived there for 26 years, and Chicago financially has been mismanaged for generations. At the time that we lived there, I think of the public pension plans, I think the best funded was funded at 39%. So it's been
that's the best.
That's the best of them. So it's been mismanaged for years. The difference now is people don't feel safe, and you're seeing this in a lot of cities in a lot of the big cities. Is people don't feel safe downtown, and because of COVID, there's not the need for commercial space that there once was, and a lot of what's happened in a lot of the cities is, kind of the classic businesses that were downtown. Think about there were banks, attorneys, accounting firms. A lot of those don't have to be there anymore. And what you've seen in a lot of the cities west of the Mississippi is a lot of that activity move out of downtown, and they set up kind of 3 or 4 downtowns in any large city that, you drive in and say, this doesn't make any sense. But what they've done is they've gotten out of downtown into areas that are either closer to the suburbs, easier commute, or taxes sometimes also dictates that in the U.S. I mean, the U.S. has a very complicated tax system that, there's local taxes, and there are sometimes now city taxes.
Is there a way back, though, for Chicago? Because the worry is you start down this slope, it's a very gradual slope, and then suddenly the ball picks up steam, and it's very difficult to stop something moving with such momentum and size.
That is spot on, Simon. Because then usually what happens in situations like this is say, we have to tax the remaining companies that are at downtown, and they hear that and then they move. So it does, and that's why I think you're seeing. The vacancy rates in a lot of major downtown areas in the United States is actually quite high.
Yeah.
When you only have 75% occupancy in downtown Chicago, it's difficult. And for those of you who've been to Chicago, the Miracle Mile of shopping is 30% vacant.
Wow. Yeah, not quite such a miracle anymore. But it does seem to me it's a lesson, I think, that politicians all over the world should pay much closer attention to. Look at Chicago as a place where incredibly successful, but if you don't focus on being business friendly, you don't focus on controlling crime, you can lose what you have really very quickly, and it can go wrong much quicker than you possibly think is possible.
Well, and there's parallels in a lot of places, even Cayman.
Yeah. I didn't say that, but I was alluding to it.
Financial services and tourism. Those are the 2 mainstays of the Chicago economy.
If you don't treat what you have with respect, it can be lost so quickly.
So now that people don't feel safe, people aren't booking conventions in Chicago.
Yeah.
So it can be lost very quickly, as you say.
Yeah. Well, that's a happy note to almost end the show on, isn't it? Goodness gracious me. But the weather in Chicago doesn't help either. Let's not beat around the bush on that one.
Look, there's 3 months. It's the best city in the United States. The other 9, okay.
That's true. Fair enough. Last, I've got about 30 seconds. Passive investing. You're still a believer? You think that's the future still?
It depends who you are. It's a very long answer in my part, but I'll try to make it 30 seconds.
Go on.
No, I actually believe that there's all sorts. Everyone should look at everything. Passive investing to me is a misnomer because you're making an active decision whether you want to invest in something. It's just how you implement it. Look, if you can find money managers or asset managers that add value over a number of years, absolutely go for it. I mean, I run a trade association for indexes, but I have active management. I have passive management. I think you need a mix of both.
Very wise words, and I appreciate we've ended on a more positive note than the horror of Chicago. Look, we are as always on Money Sense out of time with questions still to be asked, and Rick is a fountain of knowledge. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind trip around a lot of topics, facing investors and facing the general public, frankly. So thank you very much for joining me and being so sporty and covering this wide variety of topics.
Thanks for inviting me, Simon. It was a pleasure.
Absolute pleasure. Finally, as ever, a quick reminder that our shows can be found on YouTube. Type Money Sense Cayman, as well as on the CFA Society Cayman Islands website. With all that said, it remains simply to say thank you to our listeners for tuning in and encourage you to rejoin us again in 2 weeks' time.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky.
The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here, you. The Chamber Pension Plan is asking for all members to ensure their member details and contact information is correct and up to date. To review and update member details, simply visit chamberpension.ky. Log into your account and provide the necessary information for your personal profile and for your beneficiaries. For assistance in updating member details, call us at 745-7630 or email admin@pensions.ky. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you.